This class is New Drug Approval. I'm David Brushwood with the University of Florida College of Pharmacy. This is a pretty foundational class because what we're going to do in this class is figure out how drugs get on the market, how they get approved for marketing, how it is okay to place into interstate commerce a drug because it's been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. This is pretty foundational information for us in regulatory compliance because everything else that we do depends on the availability of drugs. Everything else downstream from this approval process depends on success with approval. If a drug isn't approved, then we just don't really worry too much about other areas of regulation of it. It's not there. We can't use it. It's gone. So what we need to do is focus on this very fundamental first step in drug regulation and then learn from that, build on it, and understand better what follows downstream from this very important first step of getting a drug on the market. We have three learning objectives. The first thing we'll do is discuss the significance of an article being classified as a new drug. If an article that is intended for marketing isn't a new drug, then it doesn't need to undergo the new drug approval process. That's really a huge advantage because that's an immediate to market rather than wait many years to market significant event. So what we'll do is look at how it is that articles come to be classified as new drugs and understand the importance of that classification because it means that there will be a lot of money spent and a lot of time taken to get the approval necessary to go on the market. The next thing we'll do is list the standards and mechanisms for FDA approval of new drugs. And so what that means is we're going to examine this NDA process that the FDA insists that sponsors undergo. Every product, every new drug has a sponsor, and the sponsor has responsibilities to provide to the Food and Drug Administration particular pieces of evidence that the Food and Drug Administration examines and then determines to either be sufficient or insufficient. And we'll look at the standards and mechanisms through which this process, this NDA process occurs. And then lastly, what we'll do is describe the obligations of clinical sponsors and investigators of new drugs that are used in trials with human subjects. There are people who are involved in the process of new drug approval, and each of these people has responsibilities. We'll consider what those responsibilities are and how collectively all of the people who have those responsibilities meet them in order to facilitate the approval by the Food and Drug Administration of a new drug application. So we need to start with definitions. That's oftentimes a good place to start. Define your terms, people say, and they're right when they say that. So we need to look at some important terms, many of which are familiar to you, perhaps some of them not, and figure out what they mean and why they're important. The first term to look at is the term drug. Under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there are several ways for an article to be a drug. And I've just produced here on this slide two bullets that describe the foundational, the fundamental two ways for that. But first of all, let's note that a drug is an article. A drug is a thing. A drug is a thing that you can touch, that you can see. A drug has a physical presence because it's an article. That's what articles are. Not an article in a journal, but an article that is a viewable, touchable thing that exists in something other than one's imagination. Now, you might have a clinician who develops some fantastic thoughts about patient care, and these thoughts might be adopted by other clinicians who would use them in successfully caring for their patients. Thoughts about diagnosis, thoughts about treatment, thoughts about standards of care. And those thoughts are wonderful things to have, but they're not articles. They're not things. You can't touch them. You can't see them. So they can't be drugs. They may otherwise fall into this definition, but they're not going to be drugs because they're not articles. So a drug is an article that is either intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or isn't a food and is intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Now, this is important because if an article is a food, then it can't be classified as a drug under this structure function prong of the definition. A food can be classified as a drug if the intent is for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, but not if the intent is to affect the structure or function of the body. That doesn't lead a food to be classified as a drug. And it's the intent primarily of the labeler. It's the intent of the seller. It's the intent of the person who's providing the article rather than the person who's using the article that matters. So this is how an article becomes a drug, by meeting this definition. Now, simply because an article is a drug under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be approved. Only new drugs have to be approved by the FDA. Or that's what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act says. And a new drug, first of all, is a drug. It's a drug that is not generally recognized. So we have a general recognition standard by experts qualified by scientific training and experience. So you have a standard that refers to the people whose decisions are important as safe and effective. Safe and effective, generally recognized as safe and effective. And sometimes we abbreviate that with using the letters GRAS/E, or GRACE. And we kind of have this little joke about a drug that has achieved a state of grace. If it has achieved a state of grace, that means it is generally recognized as safe and effective for use under conditions prescribed, recommended, or suggested in the labeling. Well, and that's a lot of conditions there. So let's go back and review those just relatively quickly. A new drug is subject to the general recognition standard. And general recognition means that we have to have a lot of people who agree. If you have one clinic or one group of practitioners who say, boy, this works for us, we think it is recognized as safe and effective, that doesn't constitute general recognition of safety and efficacy. It has to be generally recognized, and not by a few clinicians here and there, but by experts qualified by scientific training and experience. And what these experts rely on is the randomized controlled clinical trial, both as safe and effective. Not just safe, not just effective, but both. And under the conditions prescribed, recommended, or suggested in the labeling. So note that new drug classification is very labeling dependent. What that means is that if the labeling changes, then a product that was not considered a new drug will become considered a new drug due to that change in labeling. So every time a labeling change is made, there has to be some sort of affirmance of that labeling change by the FDA. The effect of this is that as the FDA applies this rule, all drugs are new drugs. Now that would not seem to make sense due to the literal statements within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that are on this slide. This slide would suggest that there are drugs and new drugs, and that not all drugs are new drugs, that only some drugs are new drugs. This new drug definition leaves open the possibility that there are some old drugs that don't require approval. Well, the FDA disagrees with that interpretation of this language, and the FDA interpretation has been upheld by courts. The result is that all drugs are considered new drugs, despite the fact that there are separate definitions. They are essentially the same. And all drugs require approval by the FDA. Now, you've probably heard of the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause that stipulates that if a drug is a pre-1938 drug, if it predates, was marketed prior to the passage of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, then it doesn't require approval. Now, FDA has, in effect, adopted policy that takes the grandfather clause out of existence. Basically, what the FDA has said is, yeah, pre-1938 drugs that are marketed exactly the same today as they were prior to 1938, they're grandfathered. So if the labeling is the same, if the production process is the same, if the packaging is the same, then sure, they're pre-1938 and grandfathered in. But the reality is that there are no such products, because even those that existed prior to 1938 are being marketed differently now than they were then. So the bottom line is that due to this definitional structure, every drug eventually has to be approved by the FDA. Let's talk a bit about the cost of new drug development. Getting a drug approved is costly. We all know that. I mean, there are these capital outlays that are required for a drug to be shown to be safe and effective, meeting the standards that the Food and Drug Administration applies, Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. The financial costs of new drug development through the NDA approval are estimated to be between $1 billion and $5 billion. I mean, it depends on the drug. Some drugs are less costly to get approved, and other drugs are more costly to get approved. Now, this includes both out-of-pocket expenses, what's actually paid by the sponsor, and the capitalized costs of the process of new drug approval due to the 10-year time frame that it takes. So this $1 billion to $5 billion figure includes the time value of money. The fact that if you spend money today, 10 years from now, when a drug is finally approved, the expense today is actually more then than it is today. There are also some human costs that result from denied access to a drug during this period of time when it's being studied. It's available. It's been developed. I mean, in theory, it could be used by anyone who wished to use it, but the government won't allow that because the government thinks that people should only use drugs that have been shown to be safe and effective. And probably most of us think that as well. That's what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires. What that leads to is what's sometimes referred to as the drug lag. The drug lag is the period of time after a drug has been discovered, but before it's made available. And there's always controversy about whether the drug lag is too long or too short. Now, what really adds to the drug lag is the efficacy amendments, and they are not without controversy. The requirement that a drug that's shown to be safe necessarily must be studied for efficacy as well. And a lot of people are concerned about that. They say, wait a minute, that just doesn't make sense. If you've established that a drug is safe, then why can't I just go ahead and use it? Why are you keeping me from using it if I'm willing to use it? If I'm willing to pay for it, if I'm willing to accept the risks, then why don't you just go ahead and allow access to this shown to be safe, not yet shown to be effective drug? I'll take the risk. You don't have to take that risk. And it's an appealing argument, but really misses the point, I think, that risk and benefit mean nothing in isolation. Risk only has meaning with reference to benefit, and benefit only has meaning with reference to risk. So it's always a risk-benefit calculation that the FDA has to make. There are no drugs that are safe without reflecting on their their efficacy. There are no drugs that are effective without reflection on their safety. So safety and efficacy are both important. One reason we have a drug lag is because we require substantial evidence of efficacy prior to approval. Substantial evidence. That's the standard. Substantial evidence. And substantial evidence has a very important definition. It's adequate and well-controlled investigations. Now that's plural. Adequate and well-controlled investigations. So there have to be at least two of them to meet this requirement for plurality, including clinical investigations. Again, plural. So again, clinical investigations, randomized controlled clinical trials, there have to be two of them at least. By experts qualified by scientific training and experience, these same people who are scientists and who use the scientific method to assist them in making decisions. Not clinicians, not patients, but scientists. And who fairly and responsibly conclude the drug will have the effect it purports or is represented to have in the labeling. So again, it's labeling dependent. Now, what some people say is maybe we don't need that level of evidence. Maybe a lower level of evidence would suffice, but what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires is substantial evidence. Now, patents aren't without controversy, as you might imagine. There are some people who are critical of patents for various reasons, one of which is that through patents there is restricted access to life-saving medications. And this is particularly important in the area of HIV/AIDS. In some developing nations, products like drugs used to treat HIV/AIDS have been made more readily available than they might otherwise be. The patent protection has been relaxed in order to allow drugs which are really not that expensive in developed nations to be made available in developing nations where people are desperate to have them and simply can't afford them based on the pricing structure applicable in developed nations. And there are other drugs than HIV/AIDS drugs to which this concern applies, that people in developing nations, because they can't afford them, because the patent restrictions increase the cost of drugs, just can't have them as a result of this patent protection. Now, there's another concern about patents, and it's called the tragedy of the anti-commons. Michael Heller developed this idea of the tragedy of the anti-commons. Now, that might sound somewhat familiar to you. You're thinking, wait a minute, maybe I've heard of that before. What you might be thinking of is the tragedy of the commons. That was developed, the idea developed by Garrett Hardin. Tragedy of the commons involves combined use exceeding capacity. That's where you have shepherds who are overgrazing the commons and all of the sheep die. And that's a regulatory challenge that needs to be met. How it is that we can share resources in a fair way so that no one overuses them to the detriment of everyone. But the tragedy of the anti-commons is the opposite of that. Rather than combined use exceeding capacity in the tragedy of the commons, in the tragedy of the anti-commons, the idea is that underuse is the problem rather than overuse. In effect, what Heller and others say is a single resource has numerous people owning a right to it, and they each prevent others from using the resource to the detriment of the public. So what they might say is, looking at pharmaceuticals, they might say, listen, we just have too many hands in the cookie jar. There's somebody who has a patent on the molecule, somebody else who has a patent on the process of creating the molecule, someone else who has a patent on the formulation that would be necessary to make available this molecule for therapeutic use, someone else who has a patent on the packaging that would have to be used. There are just so many people that have patents here and various kinds of patents in order to make this drug available that everyone decides it's just not worth it. So it leads to underuse of a resource rather than overuse. There's concern as a result of the anti-commons that patents retard technical process and innovation. It just isn't worth it. If I have to get a patent on this to make any money off of it, I'm just not going to do it. I'll get into a business where patents aren't so critical. And then we have a problem, a separate problem altogether, of what are oftentimes referred to as patent trolls. These are folks who are not innovative. These are people who are not creative, but they're just looking for opportunities, in effect, to take something that is available for the common good, that's in the public domain, but due to technicalities can be patented by them that will give them the exclusive right to market something that really should be in the public domain. They are appropriators of public domain goods for their own benefit through patents, patent trolls who abuse the system of patents for their own benefit rather than public benefit. So let's take a look at the full NDA. The classic way to have a drug approved by a sponsor is through the full NDA. And the full NDA depends on both preclinical investigations and clinical investigations. Preclinical studies not involving human beings as subjects. There are in vitro studies, lab studies, test tube studies, and animal studies. And what there has to be is evidence from those studies of benefit of the drugs. Evidence that the risk-benefit calculus weighs in favor of continued study. There are data regarding safety, toxicity, that are gained from preclinical investigations. And all of this is done methodically, based on good laboratory practices. GLPs are in many ways like good manufacturing practices, GMPs. They set out a defined process of how to do it. And if studies are done in ways that scientists believe to be appropriate, but nonetheless violate good laboratory practices, then those data can't be used as the basis of preclinical investigations. A full NDA also has clinical investigations, investigations that do involve human subjects. This has to be conducted pursuant to notice given to the FDA through an investigational new drug application, an IND exemption. These are not approved but become effective after the passage of 30 days, unless objected to by the FDA. And then clinical investigations proceed through the 4 phases that are well known, 3 of these being pre-approval, the last being post-approval. Phase 1 studies usually involve 20 to 80 healthy subjects, and the focus is on pharmacodynamics. Phase 2 studies generally involve several hundred subjects that have the disease intended to be treated. And then Phase 3 has several thousand subjects, and the purpose of Phase 3 studies is to produce this substantial evidence that's necessary to support an NDA. So we have these 3 phases, 1, 2, and 3, that are conducted prior to the submission of an NDA, prior to the approval. Then Phase 4 is post-approval. Phase 4 may be conducted either because it's required, because the agency mandates it, or because it's, quote, voluntary, because the agency, quote, suggests that it be done. Now, there is a certain amount of regulatory arm twisting that goes into this negotiation of post-approval studies. The agency may say, for example, based on our examination of your preclinical investigations and your clinical investigations, we have some concerns, but those concerns would be alleviated if you were to voluntarily agree to conduct phase 4 studies. And as a result of that happening, the agency might see that these phase 4 studies are included within the NDA. For some drugs, they're mandatory, but for others, they would be only voluntary, subject to this consideration that voluntariness may not be as voluntary as it seems. So let's talk a bit about the IND phase, the Investigational New Drug Exemption phase. During this phase, under some circumstances, there can be expanded access to the pharmaceutical product over and above the protocols that are being used to establish evidence of safety and efficacy to support the NDA. There are people who might say, I don't want to get in one of the clinical trials, I just want the drug. How can you make it possible for me to do that? And the answer is, well, there are a number of ways for that to happen. It's possible for there to be a single patient emergency use, and the FDA can approve that. It's possible for there to be intermediate-sized patient populations that are given access to the drug outside of a clinical trial. And it's possible also to have treatment protocols. So there are several different ways that the agency can allow access to drugs that are not yet approved, that are being studied, and for people who don't want to participate or for whatever reason aren't eligible for the studies. We also need to talk about what is referred to as a clinical hold. During the IND, Investigational New Drug Exemption phase, it's possible for the FDA to put a hold or suspend an investigation to say, that's it, stop what you're doing. So the effect of a clinical hold is that all the drug trials are delayed or suspended. The reason this could happen is that the agency believes there's an unreasonable and significant risk to subjects, one that they did not foresee but now understand, or that an investigator has disregarded or in some way been conducting research pursuant to a deficient protocol. Or thirdly, it may be that the agency learns that the investigators are unqualified. They thought they were qualified, but it turns out they're not. And for all of these reasons, the agency can issue a clinical hold. It's also possible that an IND can be terminated. The IND exemption went into effect, and the agency, through that process, allowed an IND exemption to permit the interstate commerce in drugs for the purpose of their being studied. And then the agency realized, gosh, we shouldn't have done that. Now we know more than we did then. And an IND exemption isn't guaranteed to last forever. If there's reason to believe that a clinical trial should be stopped for the benefit of the public, then the IND can be terminated. So let's take a look at the new drug application itself and what the contents are of it. What does an NDA have in it? Well, first of all, it contains this preclinical data that we talked about, this in vitro data and the non-human animal data that support the safety and efficacy of the drug. It also has human pharmacokinetic and bioavailability data. That those pharmacokinetic and bioavailability data don't have anything to do necessarily with safety and efficacy, but they show that the drug will be available, that it absorbs, that through whatever mechanism the formulation uses, the drug will reach its intended active site. Then there are the clinical data, the safety and efficacy data, But an NDA also has to include the manufacturing methods, a description of the product, the patent information that's relevant, and examples of the proposed labeling. Something else that may be in an NDA is a description of a REMS. If a product is one that is subject to a mandatory Phase 4 study, or really what has turned into a REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, that's going to have to be in the NDA and described very specifically. Now, when an NDA submission arrives at the FDA, it is simply received by them, and this is done electronically. Only when the submission is accepted is it filed. So sometimes people say, well, we filed an NDA with the FDA, and that isn't really how it happens. It's received, but only when it's judged to be sufficient will it be filed. And the FDA has an option, if it wishes, of refusing to file an NDA that they have received if they determine that there's just no sense in their spending time on a NDA because it's insufficient as a matter of facial examination. They can just decide that they won't even accept it and then goes back to the sponsor for revision. There may be advisory committee review. It may be that experts will be called in to comment and provide expertise on a particular NDA. And what's almost certain is that there will be negotiation between the sponsor and the FDA. This is what regulatory affairs does. There are people who are in departments of regulatory affairs who are regulatory affairs consultants with sponsors and whose job it is to meet with the agency and to find out what is it that you need. And then to go back to the scientists at the sponsor and say, here's what they need. Hopefully understanding correctly what it is that the agency says they want, not misunderstanding, and then once the scientists spend months or years producing this additional data, those data are persuasive to the agency that the drug should be approved. But this entire NDA process is a negotiated process. What are some other approval mechanisms? Well, something that's not on this slide is the OTC, over-the-counter drug approval mechanism, and that can be through a monograph. That's really not something we're talking about in this particular class, so I'm just going to set that aside right now. Other approval mechanisms for prescription-only drugs would include the 505(b)(2) NDA, the supplemental NDA or SNDA, and the ANDA. So let's talk about them fairly quickly, the most important of these being the 505(b)(2) NDA. It's not a full NDA. It's a more rapid approval process that's based on existing data or the literature or some additional short-term clinical studies perhaps that are much less than the agency requires for a full NDA. And oftentimes the 505(b)(2) process, named after the section of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act where it's described, is used to get approval of a modification of a previously approved drug, a new dosage form or a new ingredient in a combination product or a change in labeling. And this is usually used by a sponsor that is not the original NDA holder. It's relatively quick and it's based on existing evidence. A supplemental NDA is different primarily because it's usually used by the existing NDA holder, and it describes the basis for changes that are being made to an approved drug, an added indication, an added route of administration, some sort of an added warning. I mean, you have to get through an SNDA, you have to get approval not only of the valuable things, the beneficial descriptions, the added uses, but of the detrimental things, the adverse effects that you describe. There is a changes being effected rule that allows changes during the pendency of an SNDA to go ahead and be made, but the SNDA is the way that those changes eventually are formalized. And then there is the abbreviated new drug application, the ANDA, that we won't go into in this class because it's covered elsewhere. It applies to generics rather than to innovator molecules. Now, there's an activity that's happening right now that is interesting and somewhat confusing that warrants clarification. It's called the Prescription Drug Wrap-Up. It's recognized by the FDA that currently there are some marketed yet unapproved drugs. And what the Prescription Drug Wrap-Up intends to do is require eventually the approval of all of the marketed but unapproved drugs. This is a historical artifact that is a result of discretionary enforcement by the FDA. The FDA didn't always think that every drug is a new drug. This is a somewhat new concept over the last decade or so, 2 decades or so. And what that means is that there are some drugs that have been marketed for many years that were not approved and now have become approved. Levothyroxine sodium, quinine, for example. The list is pretty long of drugs that were either overlooked or were part of the Drug Efficacy Study Implementation, DESI, process and never got fully NDA'd. The FDA estimates that there are many hundreds of these products, perhaps 1,000 of them or even more. The thing is, they just don't know. They don't know how many of the products that are being marketed are not approved. And they have told us that they are going to establish enforcement priorities. They're going to look at these currently marketed but unapproved products. Well, and in fact, they are doing that. They're going to consider safety, effectiveness, and health fraud in making their decisions about enforcement. They're going to look at whether the product violates the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in other ways, and whether it's been reformulated to evade the FDA. So there are a variety of ways that they are gradually going through the process of requiring approval of these currently unapproved yet marketed drugs to make sure that eventually everything on the market is approved. Now, there are special considerations for newly approved products. Imagine that you have a product that's been on the market for years. In fact, there are many manufacturers of this, and one of those manufacturers decides to go ahead and put that product through the NDA process, perhaps through a 505(b)(2). That manufacturer will get approval if they can substantiate the safety and efficacy of their product. And at that point, FDA offers a grace period to the other manufacturers, but after the expiration of that grace period, those manufacturers are either going to have to get approval or get out of the market. There's some serious financial implications of this because the approved product can at that point increase their price substantially. If you're wondering whether a specific product is actually approved, a marketed product is approved, you can look at the orange book. The book is titled Approved Drug Products with Therapeutic Equivalence Evaluations, and usually what we do is we use that book to determine the bioequivalence of 2 products, but it's also useful to determine whether a product is approved, and it's available electronically on the FDA website. What the FDA grants, they can take away, so they can withdraw approval of a drug. Usually, this is negotiated, and the sponsor voluntarily withdraws. But that's not always the case. I mean, it's just if a sponsor is forced to withdraw a product from the market because the approval has been withdrawn by the FDA, that's a black eye for the sponsor. It's just not good for their reputation, and they want to avoid that as best they can. So instead, what they do is they have a press conference and announce that through a great humanitarian gesture, they're going to voluntarily withdraw the product. The reason on this slide I've put quotes around the word voluntary is because that also is subject to a lot of regulatory arm twisting. The conditions of forced withdrawal of approval are several. There can be an unsafe or ineffective drug for use under the conditions of its original approval. The FDA can essentially just change their mind. Last week we thought it was safe and effective. This week we've changed our mind based on new evidence that we have seen. It could be that the labeling is false or misleading, or that there's inadequate assurance of quality, strength, and purity. Or it could be that the NDA contained false statements of material fact. Any of these conditions can support the withdrawal of approval of an approved NDA. Almost always when this happens, there's a right to due process. The sponsor has a right to notice and an opportunity to be heard. That's what the constitutional right of due process provides. But if there is an imminent hazard to health, the FDA can immediately withdraw approval without due process. That doesn't happen often, but it can happen. The public's right to good health trumps the sponsor's right to due process. What are some pharmacy implications of the new drug approval process? Well, first of all, it's important to note that unapproved drugs aren't the same as approved drugs that are used for off-label indications. That's something that's entirely different. Two similar, but in fact very different concepts. Another important factor is that compounded drugs are not approved. Well, they can't be. I mean, you compound a drug, you couldn't possibly, in time to get it to the patient, have the FDA review evidence of its safety and efficacy. So necessarily they're not approved, but that doesn't matter, because compounded drugs that follow certain requirements are exempt from the necessity of being approved by the FDA as new drugs. Relabeling an approved drug may result in its being classified as an unapproved new drug. So if a pharmacist takes a drug and puts a label on it that expands the indication or in some way instructs that the drug be used other than how it has been approved to be, at least arguably that causes the drug to be classified as new. Then we have historically marketed yet unapproved drugs which may be subjected to the NDA process, and that kind of comes as a surprise. These drugs that are part of the prescription drug wrap-up that yesterday we had available from many sources and today have available only from one source at a much higher price. The pharmacy implications of new drug status also cause us to ask, when should an unsafe but approved drug be removed from a pharmacy? Some pharmacists would say, well, I'm only going to remove an unsafe drug from my pharmacy when the FDA catches up to the reality of the error they made in approving it and withdraws approval, or when it's withdrawn from the market. Other pharmacists say, I'm not going to wait that long. My patients deserve better protection than that. So how can we sum up this material? First of all, it's important to recognize that regardless of how new or old a drug may be, the FDA approach currently is that all drugs are new drugs under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We also recognize that the patent process encourages investment in new drug development, but it has its critics. We know the NDA process is lengthy, during which there are economic and human costs. Any change in an approved drug product will require that the drug be reapproved. And approval can be withdrawn if the public health is threatened.